tutorial, I would like to share with you a technique that I use to recreate the glorious sounds of the drum break samples from vinyl, or in other words, the sounds that made great the hip-hop from the 90s, or drum and bass, or even house music. It's a kind of sound that still finds room in our contemporary productions. Now, probably like you, I've started making music exactly this way, looking for samples from old funk records, jazz records, even rock records, or whatever could fit my beat. And I spent almost more than a decade making music in this way, until I started to suffer a little bit the limitations connected to using music that has been played and recorded by someone else. Probably you have experienced when you have a killer drum break that you have found, for example, on an obscure vinyl record, but it lacks that particular specific rhythmical variation or feel that would really make your sound great. But it does not matter how you chop the sample, how you recombine all the slices, it does not work, because what you're looking for is not there, is not in the sample that you're using. And for this reason that I started to figure out if there was a way to create my own drum samples and to have more control on the rhythmical structure. And so I started to do these first experiments by processing grooves that were created with a virtual acoustic drum plugin. Like, for example, I use BFD3, and I will use it also for this tutorial, but I wanted to highlight that does not matter what you use. I mean, there are many other software, like, for example, I don't know, Group Agent or Easy Drummer, that are almost similar and that have similar features and that allow you to get really close to the result of faithfully recreating the sound of an old drum break like it was sampled from vinyl. Let me say that this process is that I'm going to show you is based on two different stages, where in the first one our focus will be on faithfully recreating a drum pattern like it was played by a real drummer. So in this stage we are not going to think like producer but like drummer, even if we are not drummers. Whereas in the second stage we are going to apply a chain of plugins that aims to replicate the recording chain that you would expect to find in an old-fashioned studio where in the 70s, where everything was recorded on tape, where the sound was processed with these great analog machines. And so the idea is to replicate this chain by using the plugin emulation of those great instruments. So say this, just let me play a sample of this technique that sounds quite realistic to me. Well, as I mentioned, in this part we are going to focus on creating the groove, and as I said, we are going to think like drummers and not producers. Even the most skilled drummer on this planet, when he plays or she plays a groove, he will never play the same element, all the stroke of the same element, for example the hi-hat of the snare, exactly the same way, like for example we would expect if we hit play on an MPC or drum machine. And all this subtle difference that we have between all the hi-hat strokes, all the snare hit, exactly what creates that particular dynamical character that allows us to distinguish between an MPC and a real drummer. So here I am using BFD3. As I said, you can even use it, other software if they provide, like BFD3 does, a wide choice of drum kits, of real drum elements, for example, I don't know, tama, snares, or maple work kicks, etc. And all these elements have been sampled from for a lot of different conditions, for example, different kind of strokes, and specifically, most important, a lot of values of velocity. That is actually what allow us to create that aforementioned human feeling where we are going to create our groove. I particularly like BFD3 because it goes really close to working with a real acoustical kit, because first of all you can customize your kit. You can select individual elements for the kick, for the snare, for the hi-hat, etc. But besides this, it's like working with virtual microphone that you can place both close to the drum or as ambience microphones. You can even regulate the amount of bleed of the sound that goes in each microphone. You know that when you record a real acoustic drum kit, you are going to have bleed, for example, of the kick sound and the hi-hat sound in the snare microphone. Same thing goes for the hi-hat, that will record also a lot of the snare, of the toms, etc. Now the good thing of working in digital is that you can, at least in BFD3, you can regulate the amount of bleed. You can both completely simulate the realistical situation, or you can even completely separate all the channel. So cancel the bleed, for example, the snare and hi-hat within the kick, and vice versa. Then BFD3 has also this very important submix where you can both balance all the channels. You can use effects, for example, EQ, compressor, delay, reverb, drive, whatever. You can also assign sends to the channels, and you can also, there is also this very important and useful page that is called tweaks, where you can adjust the gain of each one of the channels. And more important, you can work on the tune of each one of the elements, even the hi-hat. This is something that does not happen in the real world, but it happens for the kick and for the snare, and this is very important to give let's say the tonal identity of the drum loop and faithfully recreate our final aim, that is the sound of a drum kit that has been recorded in the 70s on analog gear and subsequently has been pressed on vinyl and sampled by us with our samplers. Then there is also this knob that is called damp. Basically it regulates the tail of a sound. For example, if you set the knob to 100, that means that you are simulating the effect of a very high aggressive compression. So that means almost kill the tails of the sounds. And vice versa, if you set to 0, you are leaving very long tails. And so this is something that you normally would do with the compressor. Instead, by using damping, you can easily regulate the length of the tail of your sounds. And then, as you've seen before, there is the groove editor that looks really similar to the key roll that you find in your DAW, but with the advantage that you have the sounds already organized and subdivided for the category of sounds, so kick, snare, but even subcategory, the kind of stroke that you have on each element. You can easily draw and drag the hits and the events in the grid. You can obviously customize the grid. I've set it to 160 note. And most important, like I was saying, is the possibility to adjust the velocity. And of course, this is something that you can do even with your DAW. But as I said, the samples in BFD, there are plenty of samples with different values of velocity that easily allow us to reach realistic results in terms of human feeling. Just to make an example, I've selected here the hi-hats. And you can see that I've set different values of velocity for each one of them, because this is actually what really happens with a real drummer. Even with the aforementioned most skilled drummer in the world, he's going to play each stroke on the hi-hat, but even on the other elements, different from the other one. So even if I have a look to the kicks, you see that I set particularly a higher value of velocity on the 1 and the 2, that's where the loop starts, let's say, whereas the intermediate strokes are with other values of velocity. Now, if you as I said, now you have to think as a drummer, not as a producer. If you are not familiar with the rudiments of drumming, for example, I never studied drums, but I have listened for a lot of time old records from my collection that are most funk, jazz funk, all that kind of stuff. It's the kind of record where you are very likely to find great drum samples. So I strongly recommend you to listen to this music as a producer. So analyzing it, try to replicate the swing, the rhythmical intention, the structure, etc. Carefully listen to that music really helps to obviously to replicate it when you are within your DAW and you are trying to mock a drummer but being at the same time a producer. Now just let me play this groove but without the plug-in chain applied on the master bus. You can see here is everything turned off. It's not bad. I mean that we have good sound because I have selected drum elements that give me the sound that already put me on the right direction for my final aim. But at the same time there is something that lacks. In this first stage, another thing that you are going to do is to, let's say, do a first sketch of the mix of the drums. And I say a first sketch because when we are going to move on the second part of the process that consists in applying the plug-in chain, we're going to set some very extreme settings for the compressor, for the EQ, for the tape simulator, etc. Let's say that in this case I'm going to use EQ and compression more than a sound design tool rather than a proper mixing tool. And so the values that you are going to find are probably they will be considered wrong in a conventional mixing context or scenario. But in this case, these extreme values, these wrong between quotation mark value, will help us a lot to get close to our final result. So you, as I was saying, you do a first version of the mix here before applying the plug-in chain. But then you don't know how this submix will react to when you apply the plug-in chain. So probably you are going to once that you apply the plug-in chain on the drum bus, you have to go back to the initial to the submix and tweak some values, cut some frequency, boost other ones, etc. So that means that these two stages of the process, the one that we are illustrating now and the subsequent one, the next one, they are not completely detached from each other. They are not completely separate, but they require some kind of back and forth until you make the thing sounds exactly as we want. So at the first attempt, if you don't know what to do, I would recommend to first of all to focus on the balance between the elements. So here in this section, and make the things make all the elements sound quite balanced. So I do not recommend to go too deep with effects, did not be too surgical with the EQ, because probably all the time that you spend here, all the things that you do here, you don't know what is going to happen once they apply the plug-in chain, okay? But what you see here is actually the result of the final mix, because these are the tweakings, the tweaks, sorry, and the effect that I applied after having applied the plug-in chain, in order to make it sound exactly as I want. As you see, I have an EQ bust around the 90 Hz and a cut, very wide cut around 857 Hz, and a boost in the in high range, in the extreme high range. Also in this case, you see that this is the snare. Also in this case, you see that it's not a kind of EQ curve that you would expect for a snare in a conventional mixing environment. But as I said, I'm using EQ and compression more like a sound design tool. Like you see here, I also applied a bit of compression on the snare, the ratio of 4, the very fast attack, the middle is low release, and a bit of drive to create that crispy sound on the snare that is typical of the music that we are trying to replicate, and finally a little bit of reverb. Probably you have noticed that on the that I used that there is this delay effect, this spacey effect on the hi-hat, which is another unusual thing that you would expect in mixing drums. But you are a fan of the 70s music and bands like Mandrill or Rufus, or even the disco stuff like Bon AM, they frequently use this strange effect on the hi-hat, and I wanted to experiment it here. I played it again. And now let's see, let's examine in depth the plugin chain that I set here on the drum bus. The first element that I've chosen is this CLA76 by Waves, that is the virtual version of the famous analog compressor. There is also a great version by Universal Audio. And here you start to see the extreme values that I have set, in particular for the ratio of compression. Obviously you have to adjust the input depending on what you have in the mix. Then I've set quite a slow attack and a really fast release because I wanted to highlight the kick and the snare. And 20 as ratio. Subsequently, I have set this small cutoff frequency in the extreme lows and the extreme highs. And then the following element is this one that was more like an happy accident, because I was not happy with the bass that I have at this stage of the chain until Q2 stereo. And I try to, let's say, to work on the bass with the conventional EQ or with the dynamic compression, but it was not working, and so I experimented with air bass. It is something that you usually do not find on the drum group, but on individual elements like the kick or the bass. But I liked how it turned out. You hear that the bass that is way fuller than this one. It sounds a little bit thin. And now the next element is the tape simulator. Is another Waves plugin, is the Kramer Tape Stereo. And here, or even in this case, you will notice some very extreme settings. First of all, the playback level and recording level are quite high. Even the wah flutter and the noise is set to high values. And if I play the drum, if I play the groove now, you will see that the bars hits the maximum value, the red zone. But you can notice how the sound has become fuller and is going step by step closer to our final result. At this stage of the chain, I was not happy with the hikes because it sounded a little bit dull, a little bit muddy, and so rather than cutting the frequencies in that zone, that is the best practice in the conventional mixing, I've decided to go extreme even with the EQ, with the API simulator, the 550. And I did a massive boost in the high at 7 kHz, it's 12 dB, and 4 dB at 1.5, where I didn't touch the bass because I already had enough bass from the previous stage of the chain. And this is the result. So we are getting closer to something realistic, that both in terms of rhythmical structure as in terms of sound. And the final thing that we can do is this one. As you see here, On this channel I simply put the a sample of the crackle of the vinyl, the sound that you hear when you drop the needle at the beginning of the record and you hear that wonderful sound. And so this is a very effective psychoacoustic trick. When you add something that effectively belongs to the vinyl, it sounds really realistic. So it's this one. Now, just let me do a comparison between what we have now with some real drum breaks from the 70s. Verse 1 is very famous. It's by Led Zeppelin. And now our break. So guys, if you have enjoyed this tutorial, really hope that you have found something useful for your music, your production. I recommend you to download Artificial Vinyl Drums Volume 1. That is a royalty-free sample pack that I released on my label Silent and Other Sounds Music. It's basically a collection of drum loops that have been created with techniques that I've shown in this tutorial. It's completely free. You can use it however you want, and you can download it at this link. So see you next time. Stay inspired, stay creative. Ciao.